Introduced as an up-level trim package in the 1965 Ford Galaxy, the LTD was a highly successful Ford nameplate by 1971 and was well liked by customers as the sales figures demonstrated. Across all versions of the LTD in 1970, including the Country Squire wagon, Ford sold 370,000 units of these cars, enough to fill 1.5 assembly plants just for the LTD nameplate alone, excluding Galaxy and custom vehicles. The Galaxy would sell an additional 320,000 vehicles on top of the LTD's figures, and the custom would sell a little over 110,000 units in 1970. However, in 1971, Ford wanted to take its LTD in a bit different direction and elevate its sales even further. Thus, Ford launched a mid-cycle refresh of its second-generation LTD that was new for 1969 in 1971 with different looks not only on the outside, but also on the inside. Out front, the 71 LTD got a completely new look that bore more than a passing resemblance to the previous year's Thunderbirds, with a very pointy beak-type nose, and the LTD also lost the hidden headlights from previous years, which were now given to Lincoln Mercury division. And in the rear, the LTD lost what was the typical twin round or square jet exhaust taillights, which are now replaced by this very handsome full-width horizontal taillight treatment, where all sections illuminated on the LTDs. On the lower-end Galaxies and Custom 500s, the center section taillight was eliminated and filled with either an alloy trim panel on the Galaxy 500 or body color trim on the Custom 500s. The side profile of the car was also changed, with some very pronounced feature lines running down the body side section, and a formal roof line. On the inside, LTDs lost the super wraparound driver-centric instrument cluster, although they still had this relatively driver-centric instrument panel in 1971 that was quite handsome. Unfortunately, aside from the speedometer, fuel gauge, and the optional clock, there were very few instruments for the driver to keep tabs on what was happening under hood. The only way that the driver would know was via illumination of one of the telltale warning lights in the event something was not going well. But aside from the instrument panel, another key feature of the 1971 LTD interiors was the optional Brougham trim, which gave the buyer standard high-back seating, which was extremely comfortable, especially for long trips, and it was coupled with wonderful seat fabrics. Perhaps most interesting is that these high-back seats were standard on the LTD Brougham, but they were optional on other vehicles in Ford's lineup, including the Marquis Brougham, where the standard bench seat did not have these high backs, and one had to opt for the twin comfort lounge seat option in order to get them. Also, when it came to the Lincoln lineup, while the Mark III had these high back seats, the standard full-size Continental did not have them even as an option. It was also a unique feature that differentiated the Fords from GM offerings, as no GM division, aside from Cadillac, had seating with similar high-back chairs. Chrysler, however, did employ such seats on select models throughout its lineup. Beyond the seating, Ford advertised these cars as some of their quietest ever, and indeed they were. It wasn't just the overall interior ambient noise that was low in these vehicles, it was also the impact harshness and ride over uneven pavement that was beyond superb for the time. Ford's chassis engineers employed a very unique approach to ride on these vehicles and developed a chassis where there were no mounting points from the chassis to the body between the front cowl and the rear package shelf. The result of this was that when the car traversed over uneven pavement, not many bumps or impact harshness were felt in the interior of the cabin. The setup worked brilliantly, and anyone who's driven a Ford of this era would have a hard time arguing that the GM and Chrysler offerings of the period rode better than the Fords. Notice I said rode better, not handled better. The only downside to the overall suspension setup in these vehicles was that Ford employed super soft springs as well as shocks, hoping to give customers a pillowy soft ride, and that is exactly what it delivered. However, this did not endow the vehicles with great handling, especially when compared with their Mopar counterparts that handled very well, albeit rode significantly more harshly than Ford's. Of course, for a mere $20, buyers could opt for a much stiffer, firm ride and handling package on any full-size Fords, though few buyers did. Owning a few of these vehicles with this firm ride and handling package reveals that the ride is significantly firmer than the base cars, albeit they ride similar to Chryslers of the era with the standard suspensions. Under hood, the LTD offered several different engine and carburation choices, with the standard engine being a 351 cubic inch V8 making 240 horsepower and breathing through a two-barrel carburetor. Optional was a 400 cubic inch V8 making 260 horsepower, again making use of a two-barrel carburetor. And then optional beyond the 400 cubic inch V8s were a pair of 429 cubic inch V8s, one breathing through a two-barrel carburetor making 320 horsepower, the other making 360 horsepower, breathing through a four-barrel carburetor. This would be the last year for SAE gross horsepower ratings, which rated engine horsepower absent the air cleaner as well as accessories and exhaust. In 1972, horsepower ratings would drop for a couple reasons, one of which was the change from SAE gross to net horsepower. The other was that 1971 was the last year for high compression engines in Fords, and in 1972, the compression ratios would drop so that the vehicles could run on regular and not premium fuel. As a consequence, in 1972, horsepower dropped on the base 351 cubic inch engine to 153 horsepower. On the 400 cubic inch engine, it dropped to 172 horsepower. And the 429 engine, which now came standard with a four-barrel carburetor, dropped to just 208 horsepower. However, despite the relatively low advertised horsepower, anybody who's driven these vehicles, especially those with the 400 and 429 cubic inch V8s, will know that they drive as though they have much more power than what these figures suggest. And that's really due to the fact that these engines had a significant amount of torque at very low RPMs. The 351 powered cars, particularly the 1971 model, aren't total dogs, but they're also not fast. As the years would go by, the 351 would become less and less powerful, and Ford would also switch to the 351M engine in the mid-1970s that really was a quite smogged down engine and didn't have much horsepower. Engines weren't the only change for the 1972 model year in the LTDs. The front got a slightly different bumper, in part due to the new 2.5 mile per hour impact standards that all vehicles had to meet, where they had to crash into a head-on barrier at 2.5 miles an hour and not sustain any damage. The rear end treatment got a more significant departure, where Ford eliminated the very handsome cross-car light bar stop lamp in favor of two separate stop lamps that were integrated into the bumper. Overall, the 1971 and 72 LTDs, in whatever body style you elect to pick, whether that's the two-door coupe, the four-door hardtop, the four-door sedan, or the convertible, are excellent driving cars and highly reliable, especially when outfitted with two-barrel carburation. The rides are simply quiet and sublime, the engines are also silent under hood, and the interior comfort levels, particularly of the LTD Broughams of this era, are just wonderful, especially for long trips. The only thing that you have to be aware of is don't expect these cars to be good handlers with a mushy suspension. And yes, few full-size cars of the era were great handlers, but the Fords really were set up more for ride over handling during this time period. They also were truly as quiet as Ford advertised on TV. And I can tell you from having owned Fords of this era that they do have a wonderfully silent quality about their ride. As we close out this discussion of the 1971 and 72 LTDs, take a look at this ad from 1971 featuring Rod Serling of the Twilight Zone stumping for the 71 LTD and talking about its quietness. Amazingly, Rod here is less than 50 years of age, although he looks like he's in his 60s. Unfortunately, he would pass away just a few years after this video was made.
With the world getting noisier and noisier, it's hard to find a nice quiet spot these days. And it's becoming harder. Even out here. Noise. There's no getting away from it, right? Wrong. Because while everything's getting noisier, Ford cars stay quiet. Why? Because quiet cars come from strong cars. And Fords are built strong. Result? The 1971 LTD is one of the quietest riding Fords ever. Take a quiet break in the 1971 Ford. Ford gives you better ideas.
And let's take a look at one last commercial for the 1971 LTD, highlighting the structural rigidity and particularly the side door guard beams. Cars were becoming increasingly designed for safety in the early 1970s, and this was one feature that was not unique to Fords, but certainly one that they advertised.
The 1971 Ford LTD, one of the quietest Fords ever built. But to build a quiet car, you've got to build it strong. For example, we put strong steel guardrails behind the doors, like highway guardrails. Just how strong are they? Watch. We're going to lift the entire car, more than 2 tons, by the guardrails alone. Let's go. Steel guardrails. They're strong and durable, like the rest of the car, like our new body frame design, and our rugged suspension system. Take a quiet break in the 71 LTD or the new Galaxy. They're built strong to last longer. Ford gives you better ideas.
Thanks for watching this video on the 71 and 72 LTD. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to help the YouTube algorithm serve this up to more viewers like you. And check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.